War of the Worlds Retelling Chapter 12, Part 1. As the sun started to rise, we left the window where we had been watching the Martians and went downstairs quietly. The person who operated the artillery machine agreed with me that it wasn't safe to stay in the house. He said he wanted to go to London and join his military team, called Horse Artillery Battery No. 12. My plan was to go back to Leatherhead right away. I was so scared of the Martians that I decided to take my wife to New Haven and leave the country immediately. I knew that there would be a terrible fight in the area around London before we could get rid of these dangerous creatures. Between us and Leatherhead, there was a third cylinder with big creatures protecting it. If I was alone, I might have taken a risk and crossed the country to get there. But the person who operated the artillery machine told me not to. He said it wouldn't be fair to my wife if I died and left her alone. In the end, I agreed to go with him, hiding in the woods, going north until we got to Street Cobham, where we would part ways. Then, I would take a long way around through Epsom to reach Leatherhead. I wanted to leave right away, but my companion, who had been in the military, told me it was better to be prepared. He made me search the house for a flask, which he filled with whiskey. We also packed our pockets with biscuits and slices of meat. Then, we sneaked out of the house and ran down the poorly made road that I had come on the night before, as fast as we could. The houses looked empty. On the road, we saw 3 bodies that had been burned by the heat ray, lying close together. We also saw things that people had dropped, such as a clock, a slipper, and a silver spoon, which weren't very valuable. At the corner, where we turned towards the post office, we saw a small cart filled with boxes and furniture without a horse. The cart had fallen over because one of the wheels was broken. Someone had smashed open a cash box and left it under the debris, except for the lodge at the orphanage, which was still burning. The houses in this area didn't suffer much damage. The heat ray only hit the tops of the chimneys and moved on. But, other than us, there didn't seem to be anyone alive on Maybury Hill. Most of the people who lived there probably escaped by taking the old Woking Road, which is the road I took when I drove to Leatherhead, where they may have hidden somewhere. We walked down the lane, passing by the body of a man dressed in black. He was soaked from the hail that fell overnight. We entered the woods at the bottom of the hill and walked towards the railway, but we didn't see anyone. The woods on the other side of the railway were destroyed, with most of the trees fallen. Some of the trees still stood, but they were gray and had dark brown leaves instead of green. On our side, the fire only burned the trees that were close to it, but it didn't spread very far. We saw some trees that had been cut down by woodcutters on Saturday, and there was a pile of sawdust nearby. We also saw a small hut that no one was using. It was very quiet because there was no wind, and even the birds were not making any noise. As we walked, me and the artilleryman talked quietly and looked back from time to time. We stopped a few times to listen carefully. After a while, we got close to the road and heard the sound of horses' hooves. We saw 3 soldiers on horseback riding slowly towards Woking. We called out to them, and they stopped while we went over to them. They were a lieutenant and 2 soldiers from the 8th Hussars, and they had a device called a heliograph, which the artilleryman explained to me. The lieutenant said, "You're the first people I've seen going this way today. What's going on?" The lieutenant seemed very interested and excited, and the other soldiers were curious too. The artilleryman climbed down the bank and saluted the lieutenant. He said, "Our gun was destroyed last night, sir. We've been hiding, and now we're trying to rejoin our battery. You'll see the Martians in about half a mile along this road." The lieutenant asked, "What do they look like?" The artilleryman replied, "They're like giants in armor, sir. They're 100 feet tall, with 3 legs and a body made of metal like aluminum. They have a big head and a hood, sir." The lieutenant was skeptical and said, "Get out of here. That's nonsense." But the artilleryman insisted, "You'll see, sir. They carry a box that shoots fire and can kill you." The lieutenant was confused and asked, "What do you mean by a gun?" The artilleryman then explained in detail about the heat ray. But halfway through, the lieutenant interrupted him and looked at me. I was still standing on the bank beside the road. I said, "It's true." The lieutenant said, "Well, I guess it's my job to see it for myself. Listen, we're assigned to clear people out of their homes here. You should go and report to Brigadier General Marvin and tell him everything you know. He's in Weybridge. Do you know how to get there?" "I do," I replied. He turned his horse south and asked, "It's just half a mile, right?" "At most," I said, pointing south over the treetops. He thanked me and rode away with his soldiers, and we didn't see them again. We walked further and saw a group of 3 women and 2 children in the road. They were clearing out a laborer's cottage and putting dirty-looking bundles and shabby furniture on a little hand truck. They were too busy to talk to us as we passed by. When we reached Byfleet Station, we left the pine trees behind and found the countryside peaceful and quiet under the morning sun. We were far away from the heat ray's range. If it weren't for the empty houses, some people packing up their things, and some soldiers standing on a bridge over the railway and looking towards Woking, it would have felt like any other Sunday. We saw some farm wagons and carts moving slowly on the road to Addlestone. Then we saw 6 12-pounder guns in a field, with the gunners standing by them and ammunition wagons nearby. The guns were aimed at Woking and the men looked as if they were waiting for orders. I said it was good that the guns were there and they would have a chance to fire at the Martians. The artilleryman hesitated at the gate and said he would continue on his own. Further down the road towards Weybridge, we saw a group of men in white jackets building a long barrier and more guns were behind it. The artilleryman commented that it was like using bows and arrows against lightning because they hadn't seen the heat ray yet. The officers who weren't busy stood and looked towards the southwest, and the men digging would occasionally stop to stare in the same direction. Byfleet was in chaos, with people packing up and hussars trying to control them. Several vehicles, including some with crosses in white circles and an old omnibus, were being loaded in the village street. Many people were dressed in their best clothes, but the soldiers were struggling to make them understand the seriousness of the situation. We saw an old man holding a large box and many flower pots, arguing with a corporal who wanted to leave them behind. I stopped and grabbed his arm. I pointed towards the pine tops and asked the man if he knew what was there. He was distracted, explaining the value of some things. I yelled, "Death is coming," and left him behind to think about it. I caught up with the artilleryman and turned to look back at the man with the box and orchids. The soldier had left him and he was still standing there, staring over the trees. In Weybridge, we couldn't find out where the headquarters were because the town was in complete chaos. There were carts and carriages everywhere, with all kinds of horses pulling them. The well-dressed residents of the town, including men in golf and boating clothes, were packing up their things. Even people who usually spent their Sundays by the river were helping out energetically. Children were excited and happy about this unusual event. In the middle of all this commotion, the brave vicar was holding an early church service, and the sound of his bell could be heard over all the noise. The artilleryman and I sat on the step of a drinking fountain and ate the food we had brought with us. Soldiers, who were no longer hussars but grenadiers dressed in white, were telling people to move or take shelter in their cellars before the firing began. We saw a large group of people gathering at the railway station, with boxes and packages piled on the platform. The regular traffic had stopped so that troops and guns could pass through to Chertsey. Later on, special trains were put on and there was a fight for seats. We stayed in Weybridge until noon and then went to the place where the Wey and Thames rivers meet near Shepperton Lock. While we were there, we helped 2 elderly women pack a small cart. Boats can be rented at this point, and there is a ferry across the river. On the Shepperton side, there was an inn with a lawn and the tower of Shepperton Church rising above the trees. We found a crowd of excited and noisy refugees here, although it had not yet turned into a panic. There were already too many people for all the boats to carry across the river. People were arriving with heavy burdens, and one couple even carried a small door with some of their belongings stacked on top. One man told us that he planned to leave from Shepperton Station.